Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Tomb Raider. So, the one thing that I wanted to go and watch this movie was simply because I was curious why it was so quickly swept under the rug and forgotten about. Is it just the fact that Laura Croft is to not have a big rack of knowledge? Rack of something. Um, I like I would look at this character and you'd really see the drastic change over like video games and whatever that this character has gone on to. And really for me, like I kind of wanted to see this character to see how they like drastically change this character. But from looking at the Angelina Jolie movies and looking at this movie, like this movie does feel like the origin story of those two other films. It feels that this is to be where eventually that Angelina Jolie character is to get to, or to already be, where this is to be kind of like the reboot and the getting to the point of like you can almost watch this movie and then watch the Angelina Jolie movies and like it'll feel like it like kind of completes all of these Laura Croft Tomb Raider films or Tomb Raider films. But yeah, like I liked what they did with this character. I honestly just didn't like the pacing of this movie because when looking at the Laura Croft Tomb Raider films, it seems like the pacing was always like this throughout those films. It doesn't feel like there was much of downtime in that movie, where it feels like this film feels so much more slowed down. And so, like, that's probably my only complaint about this. It seems like they also have to have a jumbled amount of stuff for her to do in this film. A jumbled amount of stuff. Uh, because we are to have her re earn back her mansion, basically. We're having her re earn her double guns. We're having her re earn back us giving her another story to find her supposed father because that's all that really matters is Laura Croft eventually finding her dad through a number of these films. And so a lot of people could say that the other Laura Croft Tomb Raider movies could have been better. A lot of people could honestly say that this feels like familiar territory for this character, and so why go into this again? Simply because there's so many like archaeologist movies and stuff out there now. Like when this movie was really going on and being put out there, I think it was at the perfect time. Doing it now, like there has been too many like archaeological films where of course we have like so many series like The Mummy. This feels too much like The Mummy to me. This feels possibly how like Uncharted is going to break down when that movie finally comes off. I feel like this movie and that are going to be one and the same because it's a video game adapted thing, and so they're probably going to spend way too much time on certain characters instead of actually the main goal, which is to get to the actual action sequences, which I think that's also a hindrance upon this movie, that there's not enough action in this film. There is like, let's wait a while to get to that big action point, which honestly isn't all that impressive as far as action goes, because it's very simplistic, it's very simple. And so yeah, really, I think when we come out of this one, I'm kind of also really interested in going back to the Angelina Jolie films, knowing how action packed they were, knowing how gun wielding and robot fighting Laura Croft kind of things that were going into that film. And so, but yeah, I just wanted to see this film. I just wanted to check it out. Uh, there was also this kind of smaller budget movie that at some point I guess was popular called Army of One, and I think this movie kind of feels familiar to that, where like they were trying to put this movie out to look like that and visually like seem like this movie, and for some reason I guess that movie kind of caught some popularity for its smaller budget of a film. But anyways, so with that said, what would be my grading system of this movie? Uh, I would have to say it's a I don't really like. I don't want to say that this is a bad film. Because there are very few female lead action movies out there. I would really just say that I think the Angelina Jolie, Lara Croft Tomb Raider movies are just a little bit better because for me, they're faster paced. There's more action in it, and I feel like I can overall enjoy those movies more because there's action in them. Where this movie is to be a slow pace, not much of action, feeling like so much in familiar territory to, let's just say, like the Dwayne The Rock Johnson movie, The Rundown. Like, this feels very much like that, and even with that, that's like giving too much praise to this movie. That it's because there isn't this big, huge, massive action sequence that is to be like, whoa, impressive, but there is to be like just enough stuff to kind of keep you interested in this film. But I was waiting for that big, massive action sequence that never really came. So I would have to just say that this is a okay film. That this is a okay to good realm of film. Check out the Lara Croft Tomb Raider films to remember how those stories were built up and that they were fun, and that you also got a really interesting female lead that you didn't have to know much of any of the backstory of because they couldn't have been bothered. So, with that said, let's go into that double five time territory because it's about that time again to go into this thing called spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of the film, we of course have it where Richard Croft is to go on this mission because in 2009 he is to go and do research finding about a emperor called Kamiko who was to go on and find the power of black magic to use and hurt people and kill people. And so they went on to go and chain this emperor and lock her away into this tomb for her to forever not be found. She was to be put on some secret island for eventually people to make their way to get to, which it seems that this island was very dangerous to be able to have that be a thing. So now this is 7 years later, where we have Richard Croft, who is saying his goodbyes to a younger Lara Croft, who is going and kind of bowing and arrowing through an apple. And so we have Richard Croft telling Laura, it's like, well, hey, you're going to be the next William Tell. And Lara Croft is saying that that whole story is a myth. So we, of course, have Richard going on and leaving Laura. And so now Laura, current day Laura, 7 years later Laura, is to be a person who has left her fortune behind because she has a massive inheritance that is to make her kind of a Bruce Wayne-esque like person, because that's how they kind of build her up in the end of this movie to be this kind of like Bruce Wayne-esque like person. Which I can dig a female variation of a Bruce Wayne. That would be kind of sweet. Like we don't have to have like the spandex and or the cape and cowl kind of thing, but like I kind of like it would be cool to have a female Bruce Wayne variation person that goes out and kind of like prowls the streets. So that would be kind of like the Birds of Prey show, I guess. The show, not the movie. Very vastly different. So because I watched that whole thing, it was actually pretty decent show. It kind of felt small budgeted, but decent show. So Laura is going on and boxing slash MMAing a girl named Rose. Sophia and this gym owner is kind of cheering her on, but also going and like telling her what she's doing wrong. All of a sudden, Rose is to go and choke Laura out, and so they're saying, "Hey, get out of it, get out of it!" And so figure out a way. And Laura won't give up. Laura doesn't want to tap, but eventually she goes ahead and taps. So Sophie is talking with Laura and telling her that she had gotten marmalized, and Laura's like, "What the is that?" So we have the gym owner coming in after Rosa is to leave and say, "Hey, no hard feelings," and Laura's like, "No, I loved it." Like, so the gym owner comes in and is to, of course, mention like, "Well, hey, like you're behind on your dues. Like, get a job." And Laura's like, where do you think I'm going next? So Laura is to, of course, be a bike messenger who I guess is to deliver food to people. And so, because she has this like massive backpack that I think ends up saying like bicycle rack on the back of it. So Laura is to go and seemingly talk to this, I want to say, this one restaurant family. Let's try to be nice about it, because I was going to say something else here. And all of a sudden, it seems this one boy is kind of interested in maybe asking out Laura, but just couldn't get the words out. And so the mother ends up slapping this guy on the head, like, "Come on, like get the words out." So Laura goes on and does her deliveries, and so eventually she's going and making her way to the rest of these carriers, and it seems that they're wanting to go on and do some fox hunt, and she's like, "Well, what's that?" So it seems that there is to be some bicyclist who is to have this little tail on the back of their bike, and they, of course, are to get chased by all these other bicyclists, and the payout of this is $600. And if the one person is to get caught, then of course that person wins the money. But if the fox doesn't get caught, then they get the money. And so we also have this person who has a paint can on the back of their bike to have the guys track where she's heading if she gets too far, because technically she will get a head start. Of course, obviously this person who's going to do this is going to be Laura. That's why I said she easily, because of course Laura is going to do this. So like, this to me kind of reminds me of the Jean-Claude movie Knockoff, where we have that kind of this race at the beginning of that film, where eventually Jean-Claude's sneakers like basically like blow up, and like because they're knockoff Pumas, and so like by the end of this race, like Jean-Claude is basically like shoeless or like footless and just kind of making through this race because the Pumas are just awful. because the Pumas are spelled, I think, with two M's. So Laura goes off and is to be chased by these men uh, with this kind of lime green like paint. So Laura is to make her way to jump on this one truck, and none of these guys can now track her down or figure out where she's heading. And so then Laura dumps off of this truck. And so we eventually have one bicyclist who is going and trying to take, of course, Laura's tail, and she ends up getting away from him. And so there's a number of scenarios when she's making it down this part of road where she's talking to one guy and she smacks into this police car that all of a sudden sprays all this or dumps all this paint all over this guy's police officer vehicle. So Laura Croft ends up getting arrested to get bailed out by, of course, Anna Miller. Anna Miller is to be the one kind of holding over Richard Croft and Laura Croft's estate while Richard has been gone for several years. Anna Miller is to kind of be like Laura's mother in some way, or to feel like Laura's mother, because Laura doesn't really have a mother, because story will eventually tell you about that here. And I'm like, you know what? You know what would have been drastically different? You know what, if they would have drastically changed this? How about this time around, and instead of having to search for frickin' Laura Croft's mother in this film, or father in this film, let's go for the mother. Let's go for the mom for once. Like, let's change this story and not have to have every single time for us to just find her dad. What if we found both her dad and her mother at the same time? Ooh, what a different story that would be. But no, every single time it's always her having to find her father that has been left on an island for somewhere for 7 years. So Anna is telling Laura that, hey, like, if you don't go on and sign for your inheritance, like, all of this stuff will just be sold somewhere. Like, do you want all your father's hard work to eventually go up in smoke? Like, what do you want? And so Laura is to finally decide to sign this inheritance. And so when she does, there is also to be a guy there called Mr. Yoff that is to give her some Japanese puzzle. And so Laura's like, well, yeah, there had been a number of these Japanese puzzles that Richard had through the house everywhere. So Laura is to go and solve this Japanese puzzle to then get this one photo of both Richard and his daughter, but it also has a little riddle for, of course, Laura to figure out, for her to go to his last resting place, so to speak, which is a mausoleum. So Laura Croft is to go to this mausoleum and is to eventually touch this one piece of Richard's mausoleum to then open this one thing that is to showcase this office that he had been holding on to for a number stretch of time. He must have possibly bought this whole graveyard mausoleum thing to then build that whole thing in there. So Laura is going through Richard's things, and so there is to be this Play Me recorder for Laura to have here. So Richard gives her this last video stating that Richard had really taken Laura's mother's loss hard, and that Richard wanted to realize if there was a afterlife, or if there was some kind of like if there was still some kind of way for Richard to eventually meet again with his wife in some way or another. So Richard went on to study the Kimiko uh, lore to see if there is a possibility that this black magic wielding emperor could have gone on to figure out a way to give Richard's wife back to him or something along those lines. So Richard is to also mention, like, hey, yeah, like, basically, if you're watching this, I'm probably dead. So we have Richard telling Laura to burn all of his research. And of course, Laura doesn't go out of her way to do that. She goes on and takes his book, which is to basically tell her exactly where to go and who all he paid off to get to where he is going to get to, or where Laura is going to get back to her father, because she, of course, is going to do and follow the very same footsteps of her father to go and find him. So, Laura is to find this receipt from a guy named Lou Ren, and so Laura is to go on to this boat to go and find a guy named Lou Ren, and that, of course, is to lead her to three Chinese kids who are at first seemingly going to help her, but then they just turn around and try to take her, like her backpack from her, and then run off. And so she goes and finds them, and then goes and takes back what is hers, and saying, like, hey, like, you guys aren't going to get a tip. And so the kids are telling her that she's not going to get her tongue, saying that they're going to cut it off. So we, of course, have eventually Laura kind of being chased after these guys, and Lou Ren is to go on and shoot them away and scare them off, for Laura Croft to realize that this is Lou Ren, but it's not the Lou Ren that was to have gone with Laura's father. This was to actually be his son, that is to have the exact same name. What a coincidence. So we also had the moment where Laura Croft was going to need to get a boat. So she went on to go to a pawn shop owner named Alan to try and bargain with this little medallion that she had. And so Laura's to mention that this medallion is to be from a number of different emperors that eventually was to get into her having it. And so Alan is to offer her 10 grand for it, and she's like, no, like, this is to be way, this is your lucky day. Like, this is going to be way more valuable than 10 grand. And so we end up having Alan, who keeps taking a grand away every time that this is going on for longer and longer, to where eventually Laura is to take this bargain for 8 grand. And then later on in the film, Laura does come back to this pawn shop owner, and Alan is to realize that, yeah, that thing you gave me, yeah, I guess that really was my lucky day. And she's like, of course it was. And so that goes on and has Laura kind of dealing with this guy more to get these double guns that we don't ever see in this movie until the very end of this, and then we don't do another Lara Croft movie. So she ends up getting these double guns for no freaking reason, and it's just a waste, sadly enough. Even though it seems like there was going to be this cliffhanging thing that there was going to be a sequel after this, they never went into it, because of course not. And I don't think they're ever going to possibly do another Tomb Raider Lara Croft movie, and if they did, that would be a surprise. So, because, like, it's bound to happen, but, like, also, like, I just, I think they're gonna just stick to the video games, and like if they keep like plopping those out, why do they even need to do a movie that is basically going to be just like the video games? It makes no sense. So let's go back. So Lou is now not really wanting to work with Laura, and Lou is so drunk that he falls over, and so now Laura has to like shower him uh, to get him to wake up, and so Laura, of course, is saying like, "Hey, you have a receipt from my father saying that you went on and brought him to this island." And so, hey, that was my dad. So both of them are deciding to go on this island, even though Lou is mentioning how dangerous it is. And that really, when it comes down to it, Laura is offering him like $4,000 for this, but he's like, hey, like, what's in the other boot? Like, I want to know how much money you actually have. So, so Lou is like, okay, I'll go and I'll do this. Like, all right. So, while we're going on this journey to this island, we have Laura who's doing these Japanese puzzles and figuring them all out and opening all them. So, we have Richard also mentioning that there is also to be this Order of Trinity that is also wanting to seek out this Kamiko because they deal in the supernatural. And so I'm like, well, was that the guys from the other Laura Croft movies? Like, was that the Order of the Trinity, or was that somebody else? Maybe we just have the Order of Trinity just being the Matrix fans, and they're hence the name. Like, yeah, we love Trinity. Yeah, the girl that like just kicks people in the face with the crane move. Yeah. So might as well say it because the Matrix is currently out now. So they're making it to this island because Lou is to mention to her that this is gonna like her best bet to make it to this island is with him because any other boat would probably sink by the time they get out of the harbor. So they make it to this island and it's a very dangerous territory. The waves are very strong, and so the boat ends up crashing against. Excuse me. The boat ends up crashing against the kind of rocky terrain of the side of this island, and so the boat gets so damaged that they basically have to go and like think to get to just kind of jump on this little life raft, this little lifeboat thing, because this boat is just getting annihilated. So both Laura Croft and Lou end up getting separated. So we eventually have Laura, who is to be found out by a guy named Vogel and is to have her be waking up in his place. And this guy is to be a part of the Order of Trinity. And he is getting a sat phone, like kind of telling him what to do. And what really for him to do is just kind of keep looking for this tomb of this Kamiko. And so really there's to be these consistent logos that are to be popping up called Penta, and so you might not like catch them at first, but then later on down the road there is going to be some connection happening with this whole Panta company. So Vogel is telling Laura um, that that eventually her father is possibly still somewhere on the island or he's dead. So, but Laura is to just be put to work here to eventually become a digger like everyone else that is to be here. And so I'm like, yes, this is like the rundown. Like, we have Vogel, who's kind of like the Christopher Walken character, and we have Laura Croft, who's kind of like the Dwayne the Rock Johnson character, and we have like Lou, who's kind of the non comedic guy from American Pie, whatever that guy's name was. I don't remember what his name was. Because it's been a while since I've seen him in anything. But I know he played Stifler in the American Pie movies. So, anyways, so check out the rundown on Blu-ray and DVD somewhere. It's been out for a while. It's probably on some app somewhere. So, so eventually we get Laura Croft, who sees Lou, and they're of course planning their escape because why wouldn't they? So we have these mercenaries that are kind of watching over people. We end up having one digger who is, of course, to be much more older, and he starts to get ill. And so, because this one guy is starting to get ill and he's not working, we have Vogel come out and just shoot him and kill him because he's not working. And we have like Laura, who's telling him like, "Hey, like we can do the job. Like he can just rest for a little bit." And Vogel just shoots him to just solve this problem. So at that point, we just have both Lou and Laura who are like, yeah, we're going to get the heck out of here. We're going to try to get out of here now. So Lou goes on and is to try to help Laura escape by using all these kind of trick things to take down these mercenaries. And so Laura starts running like crazy. And she, of course, goes on to like she's still kind of like tied up here with her hands. So she's running off with the mercenary behind her, and Vogel, of course, to now have Laura's book because Laura was going into her backpack looking for a book, and Vogel's like looking for this, and so Vogel doesn't really care about Laura really, but like he feels that she might be a help to them to solve this puzzle, but still, like, Vogel has the book of where the thing is, where the tomb is, and so he's like, yeah, like, we gotta go and move to a different location now, because here is where the tomb actually is. So Laura's going on and finding this kind of abandoned and really disheveled plane, and so she's going on and untying herself. But eventually, the longer she stays in this plane, all of a sudden the plane is starting to fall apart kind of piece by piece to forcibly have her now abandon this plane. And luckily, this plane is to have a parachute inside of it for her to grab on to before she is to plunge supposedly to her death in one part of this plane. And so all of a sudden she starts falling. She has this parachute. She hits the ripcord for this parachute to come out for her to eventually land safely. So land technically safely into a tree where she's to smack through some branches and get stabbed in the chest. So Laura goes on and is to find a place where somebody's holding a fire. So Laura is to make it to that person, coincidentally to find out that is her father, Richard Croft. So Laura is to start walking to this man that is kind of very grizzly and disheveled, and so Laura is talking to her dad, and Richard is thinking that it's some illusion, that it's not real, and that soon it'll just go away. So, because Richard has lost his mind. So, Because he's been on an island for 70 years. Like, if he's not crazy, then his mother must have had him tested. So, Laura is convincing Richard that she's real and that this is really Laura. And Richard's like, oh my god. And so, like, he hugs her. He's like, oh my god. And so we now realize that Laura is to need some medical attention. So Richard is going to sew her up and then put some kind of thing on her, which is to make her smack her father because it freaking hurts. So we, of course, have them doing like this catch up of a thing. And so Richard has gone on to figure out a way to make Vogel, over the past years, not be able to find this tomb, figuring out some way for him to be slowed down, Vogel. And so Richard is to find out that Laura is to have Richard's book, and now Vogel is to have that book. And Richard's like, oh my god, like, I went out of my way to tell you to burn all of my stuff, my book, my stuff, and everything, because I told you that. You just turn around and you just give Vogel the one piece that he needed to come up with all these answers. And so, of where this tomb is and everything, and you're basically giving him the hand of where to guide him to go. And so Laura is really just telling her father at this point, it's like, well, we can just come here and stop him. Like, that's the whole point of it. It's like, well, for Laura to really be here is for her to stop him anyways, and to also get to this tomb. So it's kind of just like they're going into the tomb. That's the obvious mission of this movie. So after Richard is to start to kind of clip some pieces of his beard, kind of shave up a little bit, a little tiny bit. Hence me, like, also I kind of grizzled down a little bit, because I realized I'm like, man, like, I really need to kind of clean this up a little bit. Not a lot, but just a little. So we, of course, have Vogel figure out where the tomb is, and the only thing is now is they're having problems figuring out how to open it. So Laura and Richard make their way to Vogel, and so now we have this moment here where Vogel is to have his gun on Richard, forcing Laura to solve this puzzle to open this tomb. And so, of course, Laura is to figure out this puzzle and to open this tomb, which all of a sudden, what is to seem like a just door opening isn't. We just have this door completely collapse, and it's to be this great, massive cave-like opening where Laura is to be lowered down via this weird-looking rope of things. And so it seems that Laura is going to be the first one to test everything. Because there's to be this huge gap where they end up going and having this ladder. And they have Laura, of course, cross this gap first, and then everybody else to go past this ladder. So they go on and they end up making it to this tomb, and they end up opening the tomb. And so they're realizing that, of course, this woman isn't going to come back from the dead and and use her black magic on everybody. Excuse me. Just sneeze-a-thon here. So we have it where when they open the tomb, this woman's body just her everything just caves in, and so she's basically just a skeleton now. And so at one point we end up having her jump up from the dead, and we're like, oh my god, but we end up finding out that it's some weird like pulley system or something that's underneath her that is to trick people into getting so scared and running off. It's basically the equivalent of a Jack in the Box to scare these people into running off because they're like, oh my god, like this thing. So they go on and they want to take out the body because we of course have Vogel who is going and calling this sat phone with this sat phone and saying like, hey, like we found it. So we realize as these mercenaries are taking this body out of this grave or this kind of coffin, sarcophagus, whichever. All of a sudden, we have one guy who ends up getting infected with this kind of with this black stuff, this black kind of worm of a thing that goes inside of him, and is all of a sudden starting to create and come up that his body is turning very blackened and very like out of control to where they are forced to just gun him down and kill him. So we end up finding out that Kamiko like possibly didn't actually have black magic or anything like that. That possibly Kamiko just had some kind of carrier illness that was inside of her that she was immune to, and so she was holding this thing to get buried off so that way she could protect a bunch of people from a mass amount of people getting killed off here. So I'm like, okay, so there's no magical thing that we're going to eventually reconnect both Laura and Richard with their mother here. We're just now having to have this action sequence where certain guys are going to get infected and turn into monsters. Like, not really a great payout here, because when looking at all the other like Lara Croft movies, like they go into this kind of like magical realm of things when they eventually find the kind of like the Pandora's box, or eventually Laura ends up getting reunited with her father at some point in one of the other films via this kind of thing of like temporary thing where they reunite. So kind of a very weak ending in all honesty. So Vogel is to just collect a sample of this girl's finger so that way this could be some bioweapon of sorts that Vogel is to come back to give to the Order of Trinity so they can do whatever the heck with it. So as Laura, of course, is running off, and Richard is kind of trying to keep Vogel where he is, all of a sudden we eventually have another one of these mercenaries ends up getting infected, and he ends up starting to attack Richard, which then infects Richard. And so eventually Laura is hiding from one of the mercenaries, but eventually she ends up kind of getting away from him. And like I had kind of backtracked about the whole part when they end up having to go and unlock that door where there is that whole color coding system where they're trying to figure out the like the color of death, where like they end up having this riddle where they're thinking that like light is the answer, so light should be yellow. And so the whole time that they're trying to figure out this riddle, the ground is just falling underneath them. And so Laura is still at this door trying to figure out the riddle of this. And so she's like, well, it's not yellow, and it's not this, it's not blue, it's not whatever. But she ends up realizing that it's a combination of two colors between yellow and blue, which is to make green. And green, I guess, is the color of death. So they go on and open this door to get to this tomb to get this whole thing. So I wanted to cover that because I feel like I'm kind of rushing through that part. So eventually Laura, all the kind of mercenaries are gone and done with here. And so now we end up having Vogel just wanting to get the heck out of here because he has this sample and that's all he really needed. And so Laura is to go back to Richard to have Richard tell Laura that he's infected and that Laura needs to leave here because Richard is to mention that he's going to trap Vogel and him in here. So Laura needs to figure out a way to just kind of keep Vogel in here for these for this sample from this woman to never get out. And so Richard, of course, is telling Laura, it's like, well, hey, you need to go now. Like, you have work to do. So Laura is to go and do the kind of like, which seemed very like Hunger Games to me, but I think Hunger Games is like this, or I don't know. It's kind of like whatever. But like, still, I thought that was kind of like an interesting thing that there was kind of like that thing between them that was always like to be their thing. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to incorporate in here. So Laura goes chasing off after Vogel to have this fight out, which was kind of mixed, mixed of enjoyment there, because it kind of feels like the same old kind of fight out that we've had and seen in every single like kind of action movie in our lives, where we have at one point where Laura is kind of putting Vogel in this like triangle choke and like kind of very MMA kind of fight sequences here, because of course that's supposedly foreshadowing or telling us that Laura, who is to be this mixed martial arts person, that's where her fighting is going to be. That's where I guess she has learned this style. So that's the style that she's going to have and fight here. So eventually the big part of this is for Laura to go and cram this this sample of this Emperor's finger into Vogel's mouth for him to then get infected and for Laura to kick him off to have him fall down this gap that he won't get out of. And of course he's choking anyways. So Richard is to go and set off the explosion for this place to cave in on itself. And so Laura, like, I was thinking the whole time, I'm like, there has to be a reason for Laura to have this this knife here. There has to be a reason for her to use this. And I was thinking, I'm like, she has to like massively jump using this knife as a kind of like a thing to just cling on to there. And surefire enough, like there's certain parts of this movie that is predictable, like where Richard is going on and talking to Laura and mentioning about Laura saying it's like, well, like I'm stupid, and Richard going like, no, you're brave, you have bravery. And so because they end up saying like he underestimated her stupidity, and he's like, no, I underestimated your bravery, and something like that, some kind of weird goofy kind of thing there, that eventually Laura would make her way back to her father to save him, which she didn't do. So again, this is another movie where we don't save her father at the end, and her father is always meant to die. I guess they can't ever change this story now, can they? So Laura is to go on and get out of this cave, of course, because Laura, of course, will get out of here, to have kind of Lou wanting to go back for Laura after they've kind of all escaped here. And all of the guys who had been all these diggers are all just like, well, hey, like, we're definitely going to go with you because, like, your father had, like, saved all of us. So we're going to go and we're going to, like, go with you and help you out. So we go on and we have Laura who makes it back with Lou. And so Laura, of course, is to be out of here and get everything out of there unscathed and whatever. And she doesn't have one, like, trinket or trophy to her name to, like, she couldn't have kept any piece of anything, like, any kind of, like, gold or jewelry or some kind of something to just, like, hey, here's $1 million. Because I guess Laura is technically rich anyway, so I guess it doesn't matter. So Laura is to come back to eventually again go into the papers and sign away things. And so Laura is to give Anna Miller the power of attorney. And so Laura is to sign papers saying that she wants Anna to be a part of like the boardroom and business meetings because Laura is not that kind of Croft, and neither was her father. So all of a sudden, when Laura Croft is to make it to her big, massive mansion that she, of course, is to have, she is starting to put the pieces together that Laura is to realize that there had been a number of companies that Laura had owned. And out of all those companies, she is starting to realize that Panta is one of the companies. Panta was a thing that they kept seeing pop up in a lot of parts of this movie. We have the can of peaches or whatever that Vogel is to give to Laura and say it's like, hopefully one day I don't find an ear in there. He, of course, like that had the company name on there. We had one thing where they slammed down this box that had the word Panta on it. And so Panta, it's freaking everywhere. So Laura is to realize that I guess she is to possibly either own the Order of Trinity or that Anna Miller is to own the Order of Trinity. And so now Laura is needing to go on and having to confront Anna Miller and try to like figure out like what's going on with her, but they never get to that because the movie just resolves. It ends with there being this cliffhanger thing that supposedly the Tomb Raider is going to go after Anna Miller, and that will be the sequel of her going against this Order of Trinity, which never happens. So Laura goes back to, of course, that pawn shop owner, gets the double guns, and so we end up having this ooh-ah moment that they're technically going back to some kind of resemblance of Tomb Raider in this film. But yeah, so with that said, I think that's all I want to say about this film. I want to get out of here, so goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. Hopefully I've covered everything. I feel like I've covered everything, but I didn't go into the real dialogue details of things. I just kind of went through the big chunk of events. Yeah, just kind of a kind of middle of the road, okay, good movie, but like really, I probably just enjoy the more other Laura Croft editions as far as film goes. Just because they were more faster paced and it had nothing to do with the size of a character's chest, so to speak. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.